Hello, ancient history fans, and welcome to Ancient History Bites with Eric. I'm your host, Eric. Today is episode 4 of my series on ancient history, and today I'm filming on location in front of the Freemason Temple in Washington, D.C. on 16th Street. This is the perfect location for our episode today because this looks very much like an ancient Mesopotamian temple, and our topic for today is the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in world history, covered large parts of ancient Mesopotamia, was founded and united by a man named Sargon the Great of Akkad, one of the most important figures in ancient Mesopotamian history. So I'm really excited for this topic today. So without further ado, let's talk about ancient history. Sargon, the mighty king, king of Agade, am I. My mother was a changeling, my father I knew not. My changeling mother conceived me, in secret she bore me. She set me in a basket of rushes, with bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river which rose not over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, lifted me out as he dipped his ewer. Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. Aki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. While I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love. And for 44 years I exercised kingship. Okay, so what is that we just heard? Sounded an awful like the story of Moses in the Exodus. I mean, a baby that's put into the water by his mother floats downstream and is picked up by a well-to-do family that eventually raises him as his own, and he enters the entourage of the king. Sounds exactly like Moses in the Exodus. But no, it's not Moses, it's not the Exodus. This is the beginning of the legend of Sargon, Sargon the Great. And this is a story that would be passed down from generation to generation, told and retold, to glorify the main character of our story today, Sargon of Akkad, Sargon the Great. So Sargon the Great was super important in Mesopotamian history, one of the biggest characters in their history, from both a historical perspective, like he actually did stuff, like created this empire, but also for the people at the time. They considered him to sort of be a founding father of ancient Mesopotamia who united the land. And he basically became a legendary ruler and a legendary hero throughout much of Mesopotamian history. People would be talking about him for generation after generation, retelling his story. Later kings would take his name to sort of embody what he meant to the people. And they would do this for many millennia. So just to give an example of this, Sargon came to power in around 2300 BC. The legend that we read at the beginning of this episode was written down in 700 BC. So that's well over a millennium that people were still talking about Sargon and retelling his story, and then finally writing it down in the 700s to preserve for us today. So he was a big guy, super important, made the first empire in Mesopotamia. It covered a huge portion of the Mesopotamian territory, ranging from the Persian Gulf all the way into eastern Syria, western Iran, and even into Turkey. So I'm really excited to talk about him today, one of the biggest figures in Mesopotamian history. But before we delve into the big guy, we need to take a step back and talk about how we got there. So in our last episode, we talked about Old Kingdom Egypt, which was a super centralized country, nation state in Egypt. While this was happening, Mesopotamia was in a very different circumstance. It was still super decentralized, as we mentioned in our last episode. Basically, a collection of separate city-states with individual rulers in each area. So cities would certainly fight with each other over land, over territory, and one city would get the upper hand for 20, 30 years, maybe a decade, a generation. But eventually this system or this situation would change, and then the other city would get the upper hand. So there was really no stable, centralized authority of any kind. Things were really shifting and mainly focused on the city-state. So ancient Mesopotamia had a very decentralized character for most of its early history, while Egypt was being centralized. So this began to change in around 2320 BC, when one man, the king of Umma, which was a major city-state at the time, named Lugal-Zaggisi, actually managed to extend his control over 6 whole cities. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but for the times, controlling 6 cities, it's a lot more than controlling one city. So he conquered Umma's neighbor and forever rival, Lagash. So Umma and Lagash were always fighting over territory because they were right next to each other. So he was able to conquer the city Lagash, which was a big deal at the time. And then he even went on to conquer Uruk, which, as we mentioned before, was the biggest city in the area, major capital. And so he actually made Uruk the capital of his tiny little state. So it seems like a fairly small thing, but this was really a big change for the discourse in the area. Lugal-Zaggisi began to call himself the king of the land, rather than just the king of a single city. So he was accorded to have said that his kingdom stretched from the lower sea to the upper sea, and from sunrise to sunset. So that's clearly an exaggeration because he was only controlling 6 cities, but it is true that Lugal-Zaggisi had kind of come up with this idea of a united Mesopotamia led by a single ruler. And so later, Sargon of Akkad would take this idea and he would really run with it. But we do have to give Lugal-Zaggisi credit for being the first one to sort of come up with this idea that you could have a larger state or empire in Mesopotamia. Okay, so now let's move on to the big guy, Sargon of Akkad. So he's probably one of the biggest and most well-known names in early Mesopotamian history. You may not know of him if you are not, familiar with the subject matter, but he really is super important in this region's history. And so, as we said before, Sargon came to power in around 2300 BC. And the legend that we read at the beginning of this episode was written down sometime around 700 BC. So that's over 1,000 years of history where this guy is still being talked about, so much so that his legend is written down 1,300 years later. So he was clearly a really important guy, very famous for a millennium, and he's really considered to be sort of a founding father of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. And actually, much of what we know about Sargon is from legend. So we really have to take everything with a grain of salt. We don't have a ton of documentation from the period. All we really have is archaeological evidence, a few tablets, and then some history written later in the period. So we've got to fill in a lot of gaps there. There are a few things that we're pretty darn sure about. The fact that Sargon united a large part of ancient Mesopotamia into one centrally controlled empire or polity. We know that. We know that he defeated King Lugal-Zaggisi to do this. That's stuff we can be pretty sure of. But how the story actually happens, how he does this, who knows? We really don't have any idea. It seems like what I'll say is sort of the legend of it, and it seems like this was probably considered history at the time, sort of how a lot of Christians and Jews think of the Exodus as history, even though there's very little historical evidence for it. But so just keep that in mind with a grain of salt as we start to tell his story, that a lot of this comes purely from legend, and you'll see why the fantastical nature of it, that it's more historical fiction than historical fact. Okay, so the story of Sargon goes a little something like this. So as we heard earlier, he was born to his mother, didn't know his father. His mother, for whatever reason, didn't want him, couldn't keep him. So she put him in the Euphrates River, and he floated down all the way to the city of Kish. And not only that, he floated down all the way to the palace of the current king at the time, who was named Ur-Zababa. This guy, Aki, the drawer of water, or the gardener at the palace, saw him in the river and picked him up out of there and raised him as his own son. So this was a great guy, Aki the gardener. Sargon lived his life in the palace, probably a pretty blessed, nice life, helping Aki the gardener with his daily chores. And eventually, Sargon showed himself to be pretty adept at different things. So he worked his way up in the palace, and he eventually became cupbearer to the king, Ur-Zababa. And this sounds kind of like a nothing position, but this is actually a big deal at the time. The cupbearer controlled access to the king. So you can kind of think of him as like the executive assistant to the king. He kept his calendar, kept his bookings, figured out who was going to see the king and when. So he had a fair amount of power. So this was a huge distance to rise from, being put in a river to now being the cupbearer to the king. So Sargon was pretty great guy and good at stuff. So he was cupbearer to the king, and this was going fine. But one day, Sargon had a dream that Urzababa was going to be drowned in a river of blood by the goddess Inanna. Not a great omen. Urzababa somehow heard that Sargon had this dream, and he was like, oh, wow, that is not great. This guy is bad news. Let me kill him. So Urzababa decides he's going to kill Sargon because he can't have this guy running around his palace. At the same time, the king that we talked about before, Lugal-Zaggisi, was actually making plans and was in the process of marching on the city of Kish, which is where Urzababa was king. So Lugal-Zaggisi was there in Uruk. He set his eyes on Kish, and so he was marching this way. So Urzababa came up with this, kind of ingenious plan to get rid of Sargon. Basically, he sent Sargon to Lugal-Zaggisi, supposedly with a tablet that had a peace treaty written on it. So Sargon goes to Lugal-Zaggisi. That's actually not what was written on the tablet. The tablet said, kill the sender. So basically, Urzababa was setting Sargon up to be killed by Lugal-Zaggisi. So Lugal-Zaggisi read the tablet, and he actually thought better of it. He decided not to kill Sargon. We don't exactly know why, it doesn't say in the story, but presumably it was because Sargon was quite an asset. He knew Kish like the back of his hand, so he could really, possibly help Lugal-Zaggisi invade and conquer Kish. But we're not sure. We don't know why he saves him, but he does. And so then Sargon just kind of goes on his merry way, and Lugal-Zaggisi continues to Kish. Somehow, again, we don't know how, Sargon had managed to raise an army during this time, and he knew that Lugal-Zaggisi was busy in Kish, and that Uruk was empty. There was no king there. So Sargon took his army and invaded Uruk, conquers Uruk, and basically becomes king of Uruk. And of course, this absolutely infuriates Lugal-Zaggisi because he thought he could trust Sargon. So Lugal-Zaggisi marches back to Uruk to take it back, but Sargon wins that battle, puts Lugal-Zaggisi in a neck stock, and parades him around town. Huge humiliation. And so this is the start of Sargon making his Akkadian Empire. So presumably kind of riding on his laurels, not riding on his laurels, but feeling really good that he'd won this battle, was conquering Uruk. Sargon just blew through the rest of Mesopotamia, conquering city after city after city, until eventually he controlled huge portions of the ancient Mesopotamian territory. Now, how did he do this? We have no clue. We don't even know how he got his army, let alone how he managed to conquer such a huge portion of Mesopotamian history that no one yet had been able to do. But scholars do have a theory that may explain why he was able to do it so quickly, and it seems like with relative ease. So back in the day, in ancient Mesopotamia in these times, the elites had gotten a lot of power, and there was a huge amount of inequality in ancient Mesopotamia. So it's estimated that elites in these different cities in ancient Mesopotamia controlled probably 3/4 of the land there. So they controlled a vast proportion of the wealth, and while the rest of the population basically controlled nothing. And not only that, a lot of Mesopotamians were very indebted to these elites because the elites would give them loans for whatever it is they needed and then make them pay back at really high interest rates. And then if they couldn't pay back, they would actually be enslaved and would have to work for the elite for free until they could pay off their debt. So a large part of the ancient Mesopotamian population was highly indebted, very little wealth, very little land, and possibly enslaved. And so people were kind of angry and upset at this. So the idea is, or the theory is that when Sargon came along to kind of topple the reigning elite, the reigning monarch, whoever it was, people were not going to put up much of a fight to stop him. So basically, the ordinary people sort of let Sargon come in and conquer. So that's the idea of how he could have done this so quickly. And again, this is just a theory. We don't know that. But so that is the beginning of the legend of Sargon, Sargon's empire. He's in control of large parts of ancient Mesopotamia, sitting high and sitting pretty. Okay, so however this happened, Sargon managed to create a significant empire in Mesopotamia. So he created a new capital at a city called Agade that became the central point in his empire. And of course, the city received vast amounts of taxes from other parts of the empire, so presumably it became a very glorious capital city. We actually have never found Agade, so we don't really know what it looked like or even where it was exactly. So that's kind of unfortunate. We don't know too much about it. But this was his capital, and now similar to what occurred in Egypt, several hundred years earlier, Sargon and his entourage needed to create a new system to administer this larger empire. Before, all we had was these tiny cities. We had no centralization, so now they needed to create a huge amount of bureaucracy to manage this whole system. And now Sargon was what might be called today an Akkadian nationalist. So basically, he was ethnically Akkadian, and he wanted sort of the empire to be an Akkadian empire. And so he tried to rid his administration of many of the Sumerian functionaries. So as we said in an earlier episode, there were the Akkadians and the Sumerians. And so he tried to sort of diminish the role of the Sumerians in favor of Akkadians. So along with this, he also made the official language Akkadian rather than Sumerian, which had been the official language for many hundreds of years. So this was the first nail in the coffin of the Sumerian language. This obviously, this effort reduced the use of Sumerian, which had previously been used to record all sorts of things, government documents, religious texts, rations, all this different kind of stuff. A lot of it was recorded in Sumerian. Now that Akkadian was the official language, all of this now moved into being recorded in Akkadian, except for religious texts. Sumerian still remained a religious language. So Sumerian would continue to survive as this sort of religious, holy language and a learned language. So some literature was still written in Sumerian. But so it continued to survive in this capacity for over a millennium, for 1,000 years or more. Sort of like how Latin survived in the Middle Ages, even though no one spoke it, but it survived as a language of record and a language of religion and that sort of thing. But this was really the beginning of the end for the Sumerian language, unfortunately. So that's kind of sad. And now Sumerian's a dead language, but, is what it is. So in terms of administering the empire, Sargon made a little bit of an odd choice here. So what he did is in a lot of cases, he left local city chiefs in charge, or the people who ruled the city-states before. He just left them in charge, and he just demoted them to being called governors instead of, kings or whatever they were before. And then, of course, they were answerable to him. So he still controlled them, but they were still in power. This may have not been the best idea because these governors and citizens of Mesopotamia in general were used to being independent. They were used to being free and doing what they wanted. And presumably they did not like being under the control of a central authority some distance away. And then to add on to this, Sargon seems to have pursued a policy of confiscating land from the elites and redistributing it to his supporters or Akkadians, or making it royal estates. So this was obviously an extremely unpopular policy with the local elites who were still in charge. And so this just created a system that was rife with rebellious fervor. I mean, thinking back on it, it seems like a super dumb idea to do. And it's probably why it's not commonly repeated in history, because it seemed kind of stupid. And this would certainly come back to bite him and his descendants in the ass fairly soon. So as another measure of solidifying the empire, Sargon tried to unite the region culturally and religiously as well. So he installed his own daughter as the end priestess in the city of Ur. And this is a hugely symbolic and important role. It's sort of just like a very high priestess, sort of the highest priestess in the land, like the Pope or something, or, the bishop of some really important area in the United States, or, whatever, something like that. So a very important symbolic role. And as this end priestess, she basically embodied the divine wife of the moon god. So that was sort of her role. And she did a lot of religious events and, sacrifices and all that kind of stuff. Just a lot of different religious work. So his daughter took the fully Sumerian name Enheduanna. And something really cool about her, besides being the end priestess of Ur, was she's actually the first, or what we think is the first author in history. So the first author in history was actually a woman. She put her name on a series of hymns in which she actually identifies herself, I, Enheduanna. She also composed a few other literary works. So these were considered so important and well done that they were copied generation after generation by students who were learning to be scribes. So they were considered, really good texts to learn from. And so I just think that's super cool that we have all of this stuff, all of this work from the first author in history, and she, was a woman. So that's great. And in fact, let's just read a little excerpt from one of these because they're actually really beautiful. So what I'll read this is part of a hymn to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. And this more so relates to her warlike persona. So Enheduanna writes, "You have filled the land with venom, like a dragon. Vegetation ceases when you thunder like Ishkur. You who bring down the flood from the mountains, Supreme One, who are the Inanna of heaven and earth, who rain flaming fire over the land. Destroyer of the foreign lands, you have given wings to the storm. Beloved of Enlil, you made it blow over the land. You carried out the instructions of An. My queen, the foreign lands cower at your cry. In dread and fear of the south wind, mankind brought you their anguished clamor, took before you their anguished outcry, opened before you wailing and weeping, brought before you the great lamentations in the city streets. In the van of battle, everything was struck down before you, my queen. You are all devouring in your power." So kind of dramatic, but really cool and, very artistic and poetic for such an early manuscript. So that was Enheduanna, the first author in history. And she continued to be the end priestess of Ur quite long after her father passed away, after Sargon died, even into the reign of her nephew, another great king, Naram-Sin, and he reigned from 2211 to 2175. So the reigns go, it was Sargon, he died, and then a smaller king that isn't as important, and then Naram-Sin reigned from 2211 to 2175. And he was a great king, and he was sort of the last gasp of the Akkadian Empire. And Naram-Sin actually managed to extend the borders of the empire even further. He also took the unprecedented step of putting this little star symbol, which I'm showing here, in front of his name. And this seems like a little thing, like what does that even mean? But actually, this symbol denotes that the name following it is that of a god. So basically, Naram-Sin took the step of deifying himself as a king. He was no longer a king, he was a god. He was a god king. So this was a big step. And we see this in some of the art of the time as well. So here, we see the victory stela of King Naram-Sin, and we see him climbing to the top of this mountain wearing the horned helmet of the gods. So this is very unusual for a Mesopotamian king to do, and this level of power wouldn't last. But it is notable because it's the first time in Mesopotamian history that we see a king declaring himself to be a god. So, of course, the Akkadian Empire would eventually fall. There was simply too much independently minded local elites running around, wanting to run their city-state for themselves. And in judging by yearly annals, it seems like the Akkadian kings were constantly on campaign trying to put down rebellions and just keep this empire together. So it was like whack-a-mole, they would end a rebellion here, and then another one would pop up, and then another one would pop up. So they just were so busy trying to keep this empire together, it was not destined to last. These elites just wanted to be free. They wanted to run their own little areas. So not too long after Naram-Sin's death, unfortunately, central power in ancient Mesopotamia completely collapsed. Part of this was just natural, given how the region had developed thus far, a lot of independently minded elites that were left in power. But another source of blame is a nomadic group called the Gutians. Seeing the dysfunction and weakness of the Akkadian Empire, they stormed in and seized basically all of the cities in the region and began to rule them for themselves. So it was basically an invading nomadic group that was sort of the final acts of the Akkadian Empire. So this was a fairly dark century for ancient Mesopotamia, the 2200 to 2100. The Gutians were a nomadic people and were pretty much illiterate and seemed to have little regard for keeping the Sumerian civilization intact. So a lot of things in society began to decay. Art and culture decayed, infrastructure cracked, irrigation canals washed away, farming paths became overgrown with weeds. So it was really a deep recession and a dark time for ancient Near Eastern civilization. So that's where we'll leave them today, in kind of a sad spot. But happily, or hopefully, where we left off Egypt, they were also in a dark spot. But now, in around the year 2100 BC, we can transition back to Egypt for one of their great periods of history, the Middle Kingdom. And so that'll be the topic of our next episode. So stay tuned, and looking forward to seeing you again.